Hi everyone, I'm Ruth Bennett, and today we're talking about Napoleon and the Catholic Church. So, during the French Revolution of 1789, the clergy and the Catholic Church were stripped of their, church authority, their ecclesiastical properties, and their safety. So, many of them were jailed and executed, and a lot of them went into exile as well. And France just became a very anti-cleric state, and this was in spite of the fact that most Frenchmen were in fact Catholic. All of these events really served to damage the relationship between France and the Catholic Church and to weigh on the consciences of French Catholics. As an emperor, Napoleon introduced liberalism and nationalism to Europe. Liberalism, was kind of already a trend through Europe. It was a thing that spurred on the French Revolution, but the way that he did it was to abolish feudal codes and hereditary privileges in everywhere, all of his client states, and he also implemented religious toleration. And there was some ulterior motive with the religious toleration, but I think overall it was a good thing. There's also nationalism. That was kind of something that he introduced. He really worked on his military, and he made it very skills-based and not quite so much privilege-based. He also really cultivated the fierce national pride that the French already had. They had had their rallying around the flag during the Revolution, and that was still there, but he really continued to build that and grow that and use it as a tool for conquering the rest of Europe. Once he conquered places, he enforced the universality of the Napoleonic Code, which was very French and kind of, brought everyone together in this sense that everybody was living under the same rule and part of the same empire. The Napoleonic emperors definitely had some ulterior motives with religion, though. They wanted to use it as a tool to kind of unify everyone, but also, kind of use people in the church to support their own agendas. So Napoleon first wanted an imperial political religious system where the church was subjugated to the state, and he dominated all the clergy of all religions. He also worked Jews and Protestants into the totalitarian social structure. So there was some religious toleration, but I think it was more for the sake of garnering support from minority groups than it was actually for the sake of protecting their rights. Napoleon III did much of the same. He was very, very supportive of Jews and, did actually do things to help them. But when the next regime came into play, they lost all of their rights, and it became very anti-Semitic and anti-cleric. So, it was a temporary thing, but good while it lasted. In 1801, Napoleon had kind of decided that he wanted to be on good terms with the church again, and so he started talking to the Pope, and they produced the Concordant of 1801, which was actually promulgated in 1802, but it was decided in 1801. Napoleon definitely got the better end of the deal here. I think that the church really got gypped, and they should have gotten a lot more than they did, considering, who they were and how many Frenchmen actually were Catholics. But the church ended up getting a few important things out of it, in that they got imperial recognition as a major French religion. For a while, they had not been recognized at all, so this was a good thing. And there was also a clause in there about how people in power in the French government would be Catholic. And that didn't really get enforced, but it was nice to have on paper, I guess. They also got limited property for public worship and housing clergy, which was good because they'd been, without property for a while. And they got financial benefits as well, in that one priest per parish would be funded by the state, and they would get upkeep of their buildings as well. Of course, funding religious leaders with state money is really shady and problematic, but it ended up being, kind of a lifesaver for the church because they weren't actually allowed to fundraise under the new rules of Napoleon's France. Napoleon got a lot out of this deal. He got control of bishops and priests, so he got to choose them, the church would still kind of vet them and, put them into office, but he had a lot of say in kind of how things ran. He got ecclesiastical property. All of the properties that the church had to advocate during the Revolution kind of stayed with the people that had since purchased them. And he also got input into what was taught in seminaries. So he was really dipping into the purity of the structure of the church and its integrity, and I really take issue with that, because the government should never intervene with how a religion practices unless it's like directly, harming other people, which it wasn't. But this Concordant of 1801 is credited with restoring the consciences of French Catholics. So they felt okay being Frenchmen as Catholics again, which was important for Napoleon's sense of national uniformity. The Concordant's legacy is complicated but overall negative, in my opinion. It encroached on ecclesiastical freedoms a lot. Napoleon had way more of a say than he should have had in how the church ran. It also crippled the church's financial flexibility. Like I said, the church wasn't allowed to fundraise or raise money for just public worship and upkeep of property, etc. Under this new rule, and the religious organizations allowed for by Napoleon's new order were not acceptable to the church, and that they didn't have enough oversight and religious guidance, and so local parishes were left in a really, really rough spot where they couldn't raise money unless they abandoned the Catholic faith or defied the government, and so they were financially crippled. And the fact that all of the church properties were removed also did a lot to damage the financial situation of churches and hurt their ability to do social programs and stuff like that. The Concordant lasted until 1905, when the church and the state were fully severed. And I think it's a good thing, because, the road that they took to get to that point was long and painful, and I think that unless both the church and the state are completely free to do what the leadership of the respective parties want, it's not a healthy situation for both. And I'm very happy that we have separation of church and state in America. Anyway, on to the cultural climate of the church in the 19th century. There was rising secularism and intellectual criticism of the church. We've got Strauss, who questioned the historical accuracy of the Bible, Darwin, who questioned creation and man's place as kind of the best of all creation, and Nietzsche, who we know was anti-religion and thought God was dead and all of that, and that's not helpful either. And so you ended up with a lot of intellectuals actually leaving the church because they couldn't figure out how to reconcile their beliefs with what they were seeing, from the thinkers of the day, which is really sad. There were also suspicious nation states who disapproved of the supranational nature of the church, and how it didn't really subscribe to any one country, and that made them uncomfortable. And one way they dealt with that was by nationalizing education and taking that away from the church. And I do want to add that these struggles were actually common to Catholics and Protestants alike, so it wasn't like there was one group that was dealing with it more than others, but I do think that they responded differently. So we're going to talk about how the papacy responded to these issues during the 19th century. Pius IX was very anti-liberalism. He was the Pope when Italy was unifying, and so he was looking at losing a good relationship with Italy because he was losing his temporal power, losing a good relationship with Austria because they were very Catholic, and he didn't want to mess up Austrian control of northern Italy. He was looking at losing temporal power of the Papal States, and just a lot of influence that he didn't want to lose. And so he opposed the liberal forces that were unifying Italy, and he tried to fill the gap left by his temporal power with spiritual authority. And one way he did that was by instituting papal infallibility. He also published the Syllabus of Errors, which was kind of a criticism of everything that was happening in the thinking world at that time. He was against contemporary science and philosophy and politics, and that left Catholic intellectuals in an uncomfortable place, I think. And then there was Leo the 13th, and he advocated for Thomistic philosophies. He also proposed Thomistic philosophies in the sense that, faith and reason go together, and we should use both for the glory of God and, learning more. He also proposed corporate bodies, which were kind of like these multi-class living groups of people that were advocating for the good of all, but did so in a way that wasn't explicitly capitalist or socialist. It looked a lot more like medieval towns, actually. And he published Rerum Novarum, which all of us probably know. And then there was Pius X, who enforced a censure on modern thought. So he was dealing with some modern interpretations of scripture that he was uncomfortable with, and so he had all of his priests sign a document saying that they wouldn't support this new way of looking at the Bible and other texts. And I think it's an understandable move to make, but it did kind of set the church against modern thought, which I think may have hurt them in the long run. Another force at play was nationalism. It was adopted, kind of in response to Napoleonic invasions, especially in Protestant countries, because they were not only worried about being taken over politically, but also religiously, and so they got really upset about that. And then there was also Romanticism, which intensified Christian revival because it was really focused on, like spiritual things and kind of things of the heart and more personal things. But it was also a nationalistic force because there was this sense of like the national soul, which was bound up in language and culture and customs and art and all of that, and that tends to go along with various ethnic groups, for lack of a better term, and so that really helped to build the concept of the nation state and strengthen national identity. Pius IX was again against nationalism because he didn't want Italy to unify, and that hurt him in the end, but that was his position. And this attitude kind of just kept going on until 1914 when World War I broke out. Nationalistic Christianity was a big force during the 19th century. You had really powerful national sentiment. In Ireland, Catholicism and nationalism worked together to help free the country, and it wouldn't have been as strong if one of them hadn't been there. So I think that was a really positive way that it worked out. But you also ended up with this intense politicization of religious groups, including the clergy, which meant that churches were very bound up with national goals, and that often ended up alienating minority religions or, smaller denominations in these countries. And I think it's easy to, in such a situation, conflate national and religious goals. And in the 1800s, this led to the justification of really questionable overseas activity, like missionary work that was very focused on kind of changing the cultures and traditions of the groups that they went to go help. This was more of a Protestant thing than a Catholic thing, to be fair. But you also got the beginnings of racism that was based on kind of people's cultures and how they did things and Darwin, etc., as well as a very strong sense of Eurocentrism and European superiority. And here you can kind of see the roots of non-Christian Nazi beliefs. I think you can also see some parallels between the situation in 19th century Europe and America, mostly through the whole way of American history, and also today. We have really intense celebrations of national holidays that are kind of tied up with our religious identity. You can find national songs like the Battle Hymn of the Republic in hymn books, and there are sermons that are preached on Memorial Day and the 4th of July and stuff that are all very nationally oriented, all of which were things that happened during 19th century Europe. And I think that it's important to recognize that it's wonderful to love God and love country, but when loving God becomes loving your country and vice versa, and you can't really separate the two, it puts you in a dangerous position. I'd also like to talk about liberalism in the church. We've talked a little about how Pius IX was really opposed to liberalism because of, political and issues of faith. But I also want to talk about how the center of liberalism in Europe really shifted from England to France to Belgium. Just kind of as, new charters and constitutions came out, and England did kind of continue to change, but it was not at the same pace. And I think it's just really interesting to see how, progressive ideas kind of move from one place to another. And we've kind of seen that with the way that progressive ideas came from Europe to America, and I think that has to do with kind of not the abandonment necessarily, but like the less prominent nature of the church today as it was kind of declining in the 19th century, which, I obviously don't approve of, but it's an interesting phenomenon to watch. There's also Leo XIII, who wrote Rerum Novarum. We've talked about that a little bit. It was primarily a response to questions of how to treat people in capitalist Europe, because that was a fairly new phenomenon, and nobody really knew how to, well, I think they knew, they just didn't want to admit that you do need to treat the working class as actual people and, pay them living wages, and it was a pretty strong reminder to the upper class that, hey, these are people too, and you need to respect them and deal with them well. And I don't actually know how effective that document was, but I'm glad that he wrote it because, it's important to have religious support for treating people well. In terms of theological change in the church, Mary's Immaculate Conception was finally turned into a dogma in 1854 by Pius IX. And in 1870, he made papal infallibility a thing, too. So he used that as kind of a way to exert spiritual control over areas that he had lost in terms of temporal control. And I do take issue with the way that he established papal infallibility. He actually did some political manipulation of the Holy See in a way that I think is just not the way that you should run a religious group. It's a little shady, and that was problematic, but it's interesting to see how doctrines crystallize over time, and yeah, very interesting. I didn't know that before. In terms of practical change for the church, the Pope lost his temporal power, especially in Italy, because he opposed unification, and this is where you have the popes kind of hiding in the Vatican for 70 years, maybe not hiding, but refusing to entertain the Italian government until Mussolini, and that caused a lot of problems. And because of the power dynamics and questions of faith surrounding liberalism, the church veered towards conservatism, which I think really affected the way that working class people took longer to get the vote, because liberals were not interested in having people vote against them, obviously, and because they knew that the church was not going to vote with them and that many working class people belonged to the church, they really pushed off getting votes for working class people. And I think that the church's movement away from liberalism in the 1800s made it take longer to get democracy to everybody. And finally, national identity really became a big part of the church. So, people had much more of a concern for their country in relation to God, and there was a sense of national mission as kind of a Christian mission as well. And that's it. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and here are my references. Have a good one.